His secrets could destroy a nation. Alessandra Romano had never known fear until the night her family lost everything. She had been raised in gold, in power, in safety. But when her father made a mistake, she was delivered to him. Dario Benedetti watched her, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "Your father is gone," he murmured, brushing his knuckles over her cheek. "Now I own you." Chapter 1. The gilded cage crumbles. The chandelier, a shimmering cascade of Murano glass, cast 1,000 fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor. Alessandra Romano watched them dance, a fleeting, fragile beauty that mocked the turmoil brewing within her. Outside, the Roman night was a velvet cloak, punctuated by the distant wail of a siren, a sound that, until tonight, had always felt remote, a problem for someone else, somewhere else. Tonight, it felt like a prelude to her own personal apocalypse. She was 57, but the reflection staring back at her from the antique, gilt-framed mirror showed a woman who seemed to have aged a decade in a single evening. Her silver-streaked dark hair, usually meticulously styled, was escaping its elegant chignon, strands clinging damply to her forehead. The emerald silk gown, chosen to complement her eyes, now felt like a suffocating shroud. The diamonds at her throat, a gift from her father on her 50th birthday, felt heavy, cold, a stark reminder of the opulence that was about to be ripped away. Her father, Antonio Romano, capo of the Romano family, was a man who commanded respect, fear, and unwavering loyalty. Or so she had always believed. He had built an empire on a foundation of iron will and shrewd alliances, navigating the treacherous currents of the Roman underworld with a seemingly effortless grace. He'd shielded Alessandra, his only child, from the darker aspects of his world, creating a bubble of privilege and protection around her. She'd attended the finest schools, traveled the world, and known nothing but comfort and security. Her life had been a carefully curated masterpiece of curated ignorance. The scent of lilies, her mother's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a ghostly reminder of the woman who had died when Alessandra was just a girl. She'd inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's fierce spirit, a combination that had always made her feel both cherished and strangely unprepared. Unprepared for this. The silence in the villa was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that now seemed to measure the dwindling seconds of her former life. Earlier that evening, the villa had been alive with the usual hum of activity, the hushed conversations of her father's lieutenants, the clinking of glasses, the aroma of Maria's exquisite cooking. Now, only the ghosts of those sounds remained. A sharp rap on the door shattered the stillness. Alessandra flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was Marco, her father's most trusted consigliere, his face etched with a grimness she had never seen before. He was a man of few words, his loyalty to Antonio absolute, his presence usually a source of comfort. Tonight, he looked like a harbinger of doom. "Signorina Alessandra," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual warmth. "Your father wishes to see you."
Now.
She followed him through the familiar hallways, each step feeling heavier than the last. Paintings of her ancestors, stern-faced men and elegant women, seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. She felt their judgment, their silent condemnation of the choices that had led to this moment. The choices her father had made. Antonio Romano was sitting in his study, a room that had always been a sanctuary, a place where deals were brokered and destinies decided. The heavy oak desk, usually piled high with papers and reports, was bare except for a single crystal glass filled with amber liquid and a silver pistol gleaming ominously under the lamplight. He didn't look up as she entered. He was staring out the window, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in a way that was utterly foreign. The powerful, invincible capo she knew seemed to have shrunk, diminished by some unseen force. "Father?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper. He finally turned, and Alessandra gasped. His face was ashen, his eyes bloodshot, his usually impeccable suit rumpled and stained. There was a raw, animal fear in his gaze that chilled her to the bone. "Alessandra," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "My beautiful, precious daughter. I have made a grave mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Alessandra felt a cold dread creep through her veins, a premonition of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. He explained, his voice faltering, about a deal gone wrong, a betrayal by a trusted ally, a debt that could not be repaid. The details were a blur, a jumble of names and figures that meant nothing to her. All that mattered was the bottom line. The Romano family was ruined. Their empire, built over decades, had crumbled in a single night. And then came the blow that shattered her world completely. "To save our lives, to protect what little remains, I have made an arrangement," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "With Dario Benedetti." The name hit her like a physical force. Dario Benedetti. Il lupo. The wolf. The capo of the Benedetti family. Their long-standing rivals, a man known for his ruthlessness, his cunning, and his insatiable hunger for power. He was a legend, a nightmare, a force of nature. And now she was to be his. "You what?" Alessandra stammered, her mind reeling. She couldn't comprehend, couldn't accept the reality of what he was saying. "He has agreed to absorb our debts, to protect our remaining assets in exchange for," he paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "In exchange for you, Alessandra." The room spun. She felt a scream building in her throat, but no sound escaped. She was a pawn, a bargaining chip, a sacrifice to be offered up to appease a monster. Her father, the man who had always been her protector, had just sold her. "No," she whispered, the word a choked gasp. "You can't, you wouldn't." Antonio finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame, regret, and a desperate, pleading love. "I have no choice, cara mia. This is the only way. He will not harm you. He gave me his word. His word. The word of a mafia capo. A promise written in blood and betrayal." She knew, with a chilling certainty, that his word meant nothing. A knock echoed through the room, and they both flinched. Marco appeared, and behind him stood two men, strangers, but their hard faces and cold demeanor made them instantly identifiable. Benedetti men. Dario Benedetti entered last. Alessandra had only ever seen him from afar, at carefully orchestrated neutral gatherings, a figure of dark power and veiled threat. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He was tall, with a lean, muscular build that spoke of barely contained power. His hair was black, streaked with silver at the temples, framing a face that was both strikingly handsome and utterly ruthless. His eyes, a dark, impenetrable brown, seemed to see right through her, stripping away her defenses, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. He moved with a predatory grace, his gaze sweeping over her with a possessive intensity that made her skin crawl. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or a cold, calculating satisfaction that sent a shiver of fear down her spine. He stopped in front of her father, his voice a low, silken purr that belied the steel beneath. "Antonio, a pleasure as always." The sarcasm was unmistakable. Antonio flinched, but stood his ground. "Dario, you have my gratitude." Benedetti chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Gratitude? I think we both know what this is, Antonio. A surrender." He turned his gaze to Alessandra, his eyes lingering on her face, her body, his expression unreadable. "Your father is gone," he murmured, reaching out and brushing his knuckles over her cheek, the touch surprisingly gentle, yet utterly terrifying. The scent of him, a blend of expensive cologne and something darker, more primal, filled her senses. "Now I own you." The world tilted. The beautiful villa, the symbols of her privileged life, everything she had ever known, vanished in a single, devastating moment. The gilded cage had crumbled, and she was now in the hands of the wolf. And in his dark eyes, there will be a game. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Benedetti. The drive to the Benedetti estate was a blur of rain-slicked streets and blurred city lights. Alessandra sat in the back of the black, armored limousine, her body rigid with fear, her mind racing. The two Benedetti men who had accompanied Dario sat in the front, their silence more menacing than any overt threat. They were shadows, extensions of their capo's will, their presence a constant reminder of her captivity. Dario himself sat beside her, his silence even more unnerving than his words. He didn't speak, didn't touch her, but his presence filled the car, a palpable force that pressed down on her, suffocating her. She could feel his gaze on her, even when she wasn't looking at him, a constant, possessive scrutiny that made her skin crawl. She stole glances at him, trying to decipher the man who now held her fate in his hands. His profile was sharp, almost predatory, the line of his jaw tight with a tension she couldn't understand. The silver at his temples, catching the fleeting light from passing street lamps, gave him an air of both maturity and danger. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 60s, but his age only seemed to amplify his power, his aura of command. The rain intensified, lashing against the windows, mirroring the storm raging within her. She tried to focus on the familiar landmarks of Rome as they passed, searching for some semblance of normalcy, some anchor in the swirling chaos of her new reality. But everything looked different, distorted, seen through the lens of her fear. The Benedetti estate, when they finally arrived, was nothing like the Romano villa. The Romano villa was a testament to old money, a sprawling, elegant structure filled with light and art. The Benedetti estate was a fortress. High stone walls, topped with razor wire and surveillance cameras, surrounded a sprawling complex of buildings. It was imposing, intimidating, a clear statement of power and control. As they drove through the heavily guarded gates, Alessandra felt a sense of finality, of crossing a threshold from which there was no return. She was entering a different world, a world ruled by violence and shadows, a world where she was nothing more than a possession. The car pulled up to a massive, imposing villa, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The two men in the front exited swiftly, opening the back door for Dario. He stepped out, his movements fluid and graceful, and then turned to offer her his hand. For a moment, she hesitated. Taking his hand felt like a surrender, an acceptance of her fate. But she knew she had no choice. She was in his power, and any act of defiance would be futile, perhaps even dangerous. She placed her hand in his, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. His hand was large and warm, his grip firm but not painful. He helped her out of the car, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, intense moment. There was no warmth in his gaze, no hint of compassion, only a cold, calculating assessment. "Welcome to your new home, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and resonant, the words laced with a subtle possessiveness that sent a shiver down her spine. He led her towards the villa, his hand still holding hers, a silent claim of ownership. The heavy oak door was opened by another silent guard, and they stepped inside. The interior of the villa was as imposing as the exterior. The entrance hall was vast, with a soaring ceiling and a marble floor that echoed with their footsteps. The air was cold, sterile, lacking the warmth and personality of her family home. There were no family portraits, no welcoming touches, only stark, minimalist decor that spoke of wealth and power, but not of love or family. A woman appeared, her movements swift and silent. She was tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, and her demeanor was one of efficient subservience. "Signore Benedetti," she said, her voice low and respectful. "Everything is prepared as you requested." "Good, Isabella," Dario replied, his voice clipped and businesslike. "Show Signorina Romano to her rooms, and ensure she has everything she needs." He released Alessandra's hand, the sudden absence of his touch leaving her feeling strangely bereft, even though she hated his possessiveness. He turned to her, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Isabella will take care of you," he said. "I have matters to attend to. We will speak later." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the vast hall, leaving Alessandra alone with the silent, watchful Isabella. Isabella led her up a grand staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and anxieties. Alessandra wanted to ask about Dario, about her father, about her future, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. She felt like she was walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong word, any wrong move, could shatter the fragile truce that existed between her and her captors. The room Isabella showed her into was large and luxurious, but utterly impersonal. It was decorated in shades of gray and silver, with heavy drapes that blocked out the light and a massive bed that seemed to swallow the space. There was a walk-in closet filled with clothes that weren't hers, a bathroom that was larger than her bedroom at the Romano villa, and a sitting area with a fireplace that was cold and unlit. "These are your clothes, Signorina," Isabella said, gesturing towards the closet. "Signore Benedetti instructed me to provide you with everything you might need. If there is anything else, please do not hesitate to ask." Alessandra looked at the clothes, a collection of designer dresses, silk blouses, and cashmere sweaters. They were beautiful, expensive, but they felt alien, like costumes for a role she didn't want to play. "Thank you, Isabella," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella nodded and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Alessandra was alone. She walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy drapes, revealing a view of the estate's grounds. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawns. She could see the high walls that surrounded the property, the surveillance cameras that watched her every move. She was trapped, a prisoner in a gilded cage. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The events of the day had taken their toll, leaving her feeling drained and overwhelmed. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the reality of her situation, but the image of Dario Benedetti's dark, possessive eyes haunted her. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her freedom. She was now the property of a man she feared, a man who represented everything she had been taught to despise. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else began to stir. Defiance. A refusal to be broken. She was a Romano, and even in this darkest hour, she would not surrender. She would survive. She would find a way to reclaim her life, even if it meant playing the wolf's game. But first, a weariness she had never known was dragging her down. And as the tiredness began to claim her, a single tear rolled over her cheek, the last remnant of the person she'd been before, the echo of a life that seemed an entire universe away. Chapter 3. A debt paid in fear. The first few days at the Benedetti estate were a disorienting blur. Alessandra moved through them like a ghost, her senses dulled by a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She rarely saw Dario, which was both a relief and a source of growing anxiety. His absence allowed her a measure of privacy, a chance to gather her thoughts and assess her situation, but it also left her in a state of constant suspense, wondering when he would reappear and what demands he would make. Isabella, the efficient and enigmatic housekeeper, was her primary point of contact. She provided Alessandra with everything she needed: meals, clothing, toiletries, but offered little in the way of conversation or companionship. She was a closed book, her loyalty clearly belonging solely to Dario. Alessandra tried to engage her in conversation, to glean some information about the household, about Dario's habits, about the dynamics of the Benedetti family, but Isabella deflected her questions with polite evasions. The villa itself was a labyrinth of corridors, grand rooms, and hidden spaces. Alessandra spent hours exploring it, trying to familiarize herself with her surroundings, searching for a way out, a weakness in the fortress that held her captive. She discovered a library filled with ancient texts and leather-bound volumes, a music room with a grand piano that stood untouched and silent, a formal dining room that could seat dozens of guests, and a series of empty guest rooms that seemed to echo with the ghosts of past visitors. She found a small, neglected garden at the back of the villa, a hidden oasis of overgrown roses and crumbling statues. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house and breathe in the fresh air. She spent hours there, tending to the neglected plants, finding a strange solace in the quiet routine of weeding and pruning. One evening, as she was sitting on a weathered stone bench in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, she heard a voice behind her. "You seem to have a fondness for lost causes." She turned to see Dario standing at the edge of the garden, his hands in his pockets, his dark eyes studying her with that unsettling intensity she had come to dread. He was dressed casually, in dark jeans and a black cashmere sweater, but even in relaxed attire, he exuded an aura of power and control. She rose to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. "I find beauty in things that others have forgotten," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "A noble sentiment. But this garden is not forgotten, Alessandra. It is simply neglected. Like many things in this world." The implication was clear. He was talking about her family, about the debt that had brought her here. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. She fought the urge to back away, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Tell me, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and smooth, "how are you finding your new accommodations?" "They are adequate," she replied, choosing her words carefully. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, her vulnerability. He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Adequate? I would have thought you'd be accustomed to more luxurious surroundings." "Luxury is meaningless without freedom," she retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. His smile vanished, his eyes hardening. "Freedom is an illusion, Alessandra. We are all prisoners of something. Our pasts, our families, our debts." He reached out and touched a strand of her hair, his fingers brushing against her cheek. The touch was light, almost casual, but it sent a shiver of unease through her. "Your father's debt is now mine," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And you, Alessandra, are the payment." She flinched, but held his gaze. "I am not a thing to be owned, Signore Benedetti." He smiled again, a slow, predatory smile that made her blood run cold. "You are whatever I say you are, Alessandra. And right now, you're mine." He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers, his scent filling her senses. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the barely contained power that simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness," he said, his voice a low growl. "I am giving you time to adjust, to accept your new reality. But my patience is not infinite." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. His words hung in the air, a threat, a promise, a reminder of the precariousness of her situation. As she watched him go, she knew that she was in a dangerous game, a game she had no choice but to play. She had to be smart, she had to be careful, she had to find a way to survive. But she also knew that she couldn't let him break her. She had to find a way to maintain her dignity, her sense of self, even in the face of his overwhelming power. She was a Romano, and she would not be defeated. She would find a way to turn this debt, this fear, into something else. Something stronger. Something that would allow her not just to survive, but to prevail. The seed of an idea had just entered. Chapter 4. The Whispers of the Villa. The days that followed were filled with a tense, unspoken battle of wills. Alessandra continued her explorations of the villa, her observations becoming more focused, more strategic. She began to pay attention to the routines of the household staff, the comings and goings of Dario's men, the patterns of his own movements. She was gathering information, piecing together a picture of the world she now inhabited, searching for any advantage, any weakness she could exploit. She learned that Dario spent most of his days in his study, a room that was strictly off-limits to everyone except Isabella and a handful of his most trusted lieutenants. She learned that he received frequent visitors, men who arrived in expensive cars and spoke in hushed tones. She learned that he had a network of informants, spies who kept him informed of everything that happened in the Roman underworld. She also learned that the villa was filled with secrets. Whispers followed her through the corridors, half-heard conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. The staff, though outwardly polite, were wary of her, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. She sensed that they knew more than they were letting on, that they were privy to the dark undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of the Benedetti family's opulent life. One afternoon, she was in the library, browsing through the shelves, when she came across an old, leather-bound journal. It was tucked away in a hidden compartment behind a row of books, as if someone had deliberately tried to conceal it. She carefully pulled it out, her heart beating faster. The cover was blank, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it and began to read. The journal belonged to a woman named Sophia, who had lived in the villa many years ago. She was the wife of a previous Benedetti capo, a man who, according to Sophia's account, was even more ruthless and brutal than Dario. The journal was filled with Sophia's private thoughts, her fears, her frustrations, her desperate longing for a life beyond the confines of the Mafia world. Alessandra read Sophia's words with a growing sense of empathy, of recognition. She saw her own fears mirrored in Sophia's entries, her own sense of isolation, her own yearning for freedom. Sophia had been a prisoner in this same villa, trapped by the same codes of honor and loyalty, the same suffocating expectations. But Sophia's story was also a cautionary tale. She had tried to escape, to defy her husband, and she had paid the ultimate price. The last entry in the journal was a frantic, desperate plea for help, followed by a chilling silence. Alessandra closed the journal, her hands trembling. Sophia's fate was a stark reminder of the dangers she faced, of the consequences of rebellion. But it also strengthened her resolve. She would not end up like Sophia. She would not be another victim of the Benedetti family's cruelty. That evening, she encountered Dario in the dining room. He was sitting at the head of the long, mahogany table, a glass of red wine in his hand, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes studying her with that familiar intensity. "Alessandra," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. "Join me." She hesitated for a moment, then walked towards the table and sat down in the chair opposite him. A place setting had been laid for her, complete with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery. "I trust you are finding the library to your liking," he said, taking a sip of his wine. "It is extensive," she replied, choosing her words carefully. He smiled, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Indeed. My ancestors were avid collectors. Of books, of art of power." She didn't reply, simply met his gaze. "Have you found anything of particular interest?" he asked, his voice laced with a subtle curiosity. She hesitated again, then decided to take a risk. "I found a journal," she said. "Belonging to a woman named Sophia." His smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. "Sophia," he repeated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "An interesting choice of reading material." "She was a prisoner here, just like me," Alessandra said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "She was my grandmother," he said. Alessandra was taken aback. She hadn't expected that. "She made choices," he continued, his voice still devoid of emotion. "Choices that had consequences." "She wanted to be free," Alessandra said. He looked at her, his dark eyes piercing. "Freedom is a luxury we cannot afford, Alessandra. Not in our world." "Then what kind of world is it?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "A world where women are treated like possessions, where lives are traded like commodities." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "It is a world of survival, Alessandra. A world where loyalty is paramount, where betrayal is punished swiftly and brutally. A world where the strong survive and the weak perish. And what am I in this world?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "A pawn? A trophy? A prisoner?" He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are whatever I choose to make you, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and resonant. And right now, you are a mystery I intend to solve. His words, his touch, sent a shiver through her. She was afraid of him, yes, but there was also something else, a strange fascination, a pull towards the darkness he represented. She was playing a dangerous game, but she was also starting to understand the rules. And she was beginning to realize that she might have more power than she thought. The whispers of the villa were, in a way, giving her strength. A plan, however fragile, was beginning to take form. Chapter 5. Scars Beneath the Surface. The following weeks saw a subtle shift in the dynamic between Alessandra and Dario. He began to seek her out more often, engaging her in conversations, testing her, probing her defenses. He seemed fascinated by her resilience, her refusal to be cowed by his power. He challenged her opinions, debated her beliefs, and pushed her to reveal more of herself than she intended. She, in turn, began to study him more closely, observing his moods, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She learned that he was a man of complex contradictions. He could be ruthless and cruel, but he also possessed a sharp intellect, a dry wit, and a surprising capacity for tenderness. She saw glimpses of a loneliness beneath his hardened exterior, a weariness that hinted at a life lived on the edge of violence and betrayal. One evening, they were walking together in the neglected garden, the air filled with the scent of roses and the sound of crickets chirping. Dario stopped by a crumbling statue of a winged angel, its face eroded by time and weather. "This garden reminds me of my mother," he said, his voice unusually soft. "She used to spend hours here, tending to the flowers." Alessandra looked at him, surprised by this unexpected glimpse into his past. "Was she like Sophia?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He turned to her, his eyes shadowed.
"No," he said.
"My mother was strong. She understood the rules of our world. She accepted her fate. And did she love your father?" Alessandra asked, daring to probe deeper. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Love is a complicated word, Alessandra," he finally said, "especially in our world. It can be a strength, but it can also be a weakness, a liability. And do you believe in it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "I believe in loyalty," he said. "In duty. In honor. Those are the things that matter." "And what about happiness?"
she asked.
"Does that not matter?" He smiled, a sad, wistful smile that made her heart ache. "Happiness is a fleeting illusion, Alessandra. A dream that is quickly shattered by reality." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was gentle, almost tender, and it sent a shiver through her. "You have scars, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and resonant. "I can see them in your eyes. The scars of a life lived in a gilded cage. A life of privilege, but also of limitations." She flinched, surprised by his perceptiveness. He was seeing beneath her carefully constructed facade, seeing the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "We all have scars, Signore Benedetti," she replied, her voice steady. "Some are visible, some are not." He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "And some scars," he said, "are self-inflicted." He dropped his hand, the sudden absence of his touch leaving her feeling strangely bereft. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, pondering his words. Later that night, she found herself drawn to his study. She knew it was forbidden, but she couldn't resist the urge to explore the space where he spent so much of his time, the space where he held the reins of power. She waited until the villa was quiet, until the staff had retired for the night. Then, she crept down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The door to the study was unlocked. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old books, leather, and cigar smoke. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes on history, law, and philosophy. A large, mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, files, and a gleaming silver pistol. Alessandra moved towards the desk, her eyes scanning the documents, searching for anything that might give her an insight into Dario's operations, his weaknesses, his secrets. She found a file labeled Romano, her heart skipping a beat. She carefully opened it, her hands trembling. Inside, she found a detailed account of her father's business dealings, his debts, his betrayals. She saw the cold, calculating assessment of the Romano family's worth, the ruthless decision to absorb them into the Benedetti empire. She saw her own name listed as an asset, a piece of property to be acquired. But she also found something else. Tucked away at the back of the file was a photograph. It was old and faded, showing a young Dario standing next to a beautiful woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. The woman was holding a baby, a small child with a mischievous grin. Alessandra recognized the woman. It was the woman from the garden, Dario's mother. And the baby. It was Dario himself, a carefree child before the weight of the Mafia world had settled on his shoulders. She stared at the photograph, her heart aching with a sudden, unexpected wave of empathy. She saw a glimpse of the man he might have been, the man he could have been if his life had taken a different path. She heard a noise behind her and quickly closed the file, her heart pounding. She turned to see Dario standing in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She stood her ground, her chin lifted in defiance.
"I wanted to understand," she said.
"I wanted to see the world through your eyes." He walked towards her, his eyes blazing. "This is not your world, Alessandra," he said. "You do not belong here." "And where do I belong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "In a cage of your making?" He stopped in front of her, his body close to hers, his scent filling her senses. "You belong to me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He reached out and grabbed her, pulling her against him, his grip tight and possessive. She could feel the heat of his body, the rapid beat of his heart. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, desire, and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. It was fear. He was scared. And so was she. A spark had been ignited. A challenge issued. A silent acknowledgement. The scars had been touched, and it felt dangerous, exhilarating, and inevitable. Chapter 6. A glimmer of defiance. The tension between Alessandra and Dario was a palpable thing, a charged current that ran beneath every interaction. His possessiveness intensified, his gaze lingering on her, his touch more frequent, more deliberate. He seemed determined to break her, to mold her into the submissive, obedient woman he expected her to be. But with every attempt, her defiance grew stronger, fueled by a growing understanding of his vulnerabilities and a desperate need to reclaim her agency. She began to challenge him more openly, questioning his decisions, disagreeing with his opinions, refusing to be silenced. She used her intelligence, her wit, her knowledge of the world outside the Mafia to subtly undermine his authority, to chip away at his control. One evening, during dinner, he was discussing a business deal with one of his lieutenants, a brutal, ambitious man named Lorenzo. Lorenzo was advocating for a violent takeover of a rival family's territory, a move that Alessandra knew would lead to a bloody war. "Signore Benedetti," she said, her voice calm and measured, interrupting their conversation. "Have you considered the consequences of such an action? The lives that will be lost? The instability it will create?" Lorenzo glared at her, his eyes filled with contempt. "Signorina, this is not your concern," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Dario silenced him with a look. "Let her speak, Lorenzo," he said, his gaze fixed on Alessandra. "There are other ways to achieve your goals," she continued, addressing Dario directly. "Negotiation, compromise, strategic alliances. Violence should always be the last resort." Lorenzo scoffed. "You speak of compromise with our enemies? You are naive, Signorina." "I speak of pragmatism," Alessandra retorted. "Of finding a way to achieve your objectives without unnecessary bloodshed." Dario listened intently, his expression unreadable. He seemed intrigued by her audacity, by her willingness to challenge him in front of his lieutenant. "And what makes you think you understand our business, Alessandra?" he asked, his voice laced with a subtle amusement. I may not be a part of your world, she replied, but I understand human nature. I understand power. And I understand that violence begets violence. The conversation continued, with Alessandra holding her own, arguing her points with logic and conviction. She didn't convince Dario to abandon his plans entirely, but she did manage to plant a seed of doubt in his mind, to make him reconsider his approach. After Lorenzo left, Dario turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and frustration. You are a dangerous woman, Alessandra, he said, his voice low and resonant. I am simply a woman who refuses to be silent, she replied. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face. Perhaps that is what I find so intriguing about you. He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. The touch sent a shiver through her, a confusing mix of fear and desire. You remind me of someone, he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. Your mother? She asked, remembering the photograph in his study. He nodded. She had the same fire, the same spirit. She also refused to be tamed. And what happened to her? Alessandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. His smile faded, his eyes darkening. She learned the hard way that defiance has consequences. The warning was clear, but Alessandra refused to be intimidated. She met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. I am not your mother, Signore Benedetti, she said. And I will not share her fate. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss of dominance, of possession, but there was also a hint of something else, a flicker of vulnerability, of longing. It was a kiss that spoke of a battle of wills, of a dangerous attraction, of a connection that neither of them could deny. Alessandra didn't resist, but she didn't fully surrender either. She met his kiss with a hesitant curiosity, a willingness to explore the dangerous territory that lay between them. She felt a surge of power, a sense that she was not entirely helpless in this game. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were filled with a question, a challenge. You are playing with fire, Alessandra, he said, his voice hoarse. Perhaps, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. But fire can also be a source of warmth and light. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, staring after her. She knew she was taking a risk, pushing the boundaries of their unspoken agreement. But she also knew that she couldn't go back. She had tasted a glimmer of defiance, a spark of power, and she wouldn't let it be extinguished. The game had changed, and she was no longer just a pawn. She was a player, and she was determined to win. Or, if winning was impossible, to make the cost of her defeat so high that it would feel like a victory. The glimmer had not been extinguished. It had caught, and it was beginning to spread. Chapter 7. The Weight of Legacy. The kiss had changed everything. It hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the dangerous attraction that simmered beneath the surface of their interactions. Dario's behavior became even more contradictory. He was both more possessive and more respectful, more demanding and more considerate. He seemed torn between his desire to control her and his growing admiration for her strength and independence. Alessandra, in turn, found herself increasingly drawn to him, despite her fear and her better judgment. She saw glimpses of the man beneath the capo, the man who had been scarred by his past, burdened by his legacy. She began to understand the weight of his responsibilities, the constant pressure he was under, the loneliness of his position. One evening, he invited her to join him in his study. She entered cautiously, remembering their previous encounter in this room. He was sitting at his desk, reading a document, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening slightly. Alessandra, he said, his voice welcoming.
Come in.
He gestured towards a chair opposite his desk. She sat down, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the details she had missed before. She noticed a small, framed photograph on a side table, partially hidden behind a stack of books. It was a picture of Dario as a young man, standing next to a beautiful woman with dark hair and sparkling eyes. It was the same woman from the photograph she had found in the Romano file, his mother. She was beautiful, Alessandra said, her voice soft. Dario followed her gaze, his expression turning wistful. She was, he agreed. And she was everything to me. He told her about his childhood, about his mother's love and guidance, about his father's strict and often brutal discipline. He spoke of the expectations that had been placed on him from a young age, the pressure to follow in his father's footsteps, to become the next capo of the Benedetti family. I never wanted this life, he said, his voice filled with a rare vulnerability. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build things, not destroy them. Alessandra listened, her heart aching for the young man he had never been allowed to be. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the weight of the legacy he had inherited. But you had no choice, she said, understanding. He nodded. In our world, there is no choice. Only duty. Only obligation. He showed her the family tree, a sprawling document that traced the Benedetti lineage back centuries. He explained the history of the family, the feuds, the alliances, the betrayals. He showed her the names of the men who had come before him, the capos who had ruled the family with an iron fist. This is my burden, Alessandra, he said, gesturing towards the family tree. This is the weight I carry. The weight of generations. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness that came from a lifetime of living on the edge, of constantly fighting to maintain power, to protect his family, to uphold the code. But it doesn't have to be this way, she said, her voice filled with a sudden conviction. You can change things. You can break the cycle. He looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. And how do you propose I do that, Alessandra? He asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. By choosing a different path, she replied. By prioritizing peace over war, compromise over conflict, love over fear. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. You are an idealist, Alessandra, he said. A dreamer. But our world is not built for dreamers. Then perhaps it's time to build a new world, she said, her voice firm. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. And would you help me build this new world, Alessandra? He asked, his voice low and resonant. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. It was an invitation, a challenge, a plea. It was a recognition of her strength, her influence, her potential to change him, to change his world. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the risks, the dangers, the potential for heartbreak. But she also knew that she couldn't turn away. She had come to care for him, to see the good in him, to believe in the possibility of redemption. She has to be careful. She had to be sure. I would, she said, her voice steady. But not as your prisoner. As your partner. His eyes widened slightly, surprised by her boldness. He considered her words, his expression thoughtful. The weight of legacy was crushing. Could he shed it? Could he listen to her? She could almost see the thoughts, the calculations, the dangers. And for the first time, she felt something akin to hope, not just for herself, but for him, for the future they might build together. It was a fragile hope, a dangerous hope, but it was there, a flickering flame in the darkness of the Benedetti world. Tonight, legacy would battle hope. And both knew it. Chapter 8. Echoes of a Lost Life. The days following their conversation in the study were marked by a subtle but significant shift in their relationship. Dario began to include Alessandra in more aspects of his life, seeking her advice, her opinion, her perspective. He took her on drives through the Roman countryside, showing her the hidden beauty of the landscape, the ancient ruins that spoke of a past far removed from the violence and intrigue of their present. He shared stories with her, anecdotes from his childhood, memories of his mother, glimpses into the life he had lost, the life he might have had. He spoke of his regrets, his mistakes, the things he wished he could change. He revealed a vulnerability, a depth of feeling that he had kept hidden from everyone else. Alessandra, in turn, began to open up to him, sharing her own experiences, her own dreams, her own fears. She told him about her sheltered upbringing, her longing for adventure, her frustration with the limitations that had been placed on her as a woman in the Romano family. She spoke of her desire to make a difference, to leave her mark on the world, to find a purpose beyond the confines of her privileged existence. One afternoon, they were driving along the coast, the sea stretching out before them, vast and blue and endless. Dario pulled the car over to a secluded overlook, the view breathtaking. "This is where I used to come with my mother," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a nostalgic longing. She loved the sea. She said it reminded her of freedom. Alessandra looked at him, her heart aching for the boy he had been, the boy who had lost his mother too soon, the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if she began?" Then hesitated, unsure if she was crossing a line. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "If I hadn't been born a Benedetti?" He finished for her. "Yes, Alessandra. I think about it often." He told her about his dreams of becoming an architect, of designing buildings that would inspire and uplift, of creating beauty instead of destruction. He spoke of his passion for history, for art, for the things that nourished his soul. "But those are just dreams," he said, his voice tinged with a bitter resignation. "Dreams that can never be realized." "Why not?" Alessandra asked, challenging him. "You are the capo, Dario. You have the power to change things. You can choose a different path." He looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Do you really believe that, Alessandra?" he asked. "Do you believe that a man like me can be redeemed?" "I believe that everyone deserves a second chance," she replied, her voice firm. "I believe that it's never too late to change, to make amends, to choose a better way." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "You see the good in me, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Even when I don't see it myself." "I see the man you could be," she replied. "The man you were meant to be." He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. "And what if that man disappoints you?" he asked, a hint of fear in his voice. "Then I will have lost nothing," she replied, her voice steady. "Because I came to you with nothing, Dario. You took everything I had. But you also gave me something I never expected. You gave me a purpose." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was different from their previous encounters. It was a kiss of tenderness, of gratitude, of a burgeoning love that neither of them could deny. It was a kiss that spoke of a shared hope, a shared dream, a shared future. As they drove back to the villa, the sun setting in a blaze of glory, Alessandra felt a sense of peace, of contentment, that she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and dangers. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Dario, and he had her. And together, they might just be able to forge a new path, a new life, a new world. But as they approached the villa, they saw a car parked outside, a car that Alessandra recognized. It belonged to Lorenzo, Dario's ambitious and ruthless lieutenant. A sense of unease settled over her. Lorenzo's presence was never a good sign. Something was wrong. The echoes of his lost life were beautiful and haunting, but the present, the reality of the Benedetti world, was about to come crashing back. The peace was over. The danger had returned. And she knew, with a sinking heart, that the fight was far from over. It had barely begun. Chapter 9. Unspoken Bonds. Dario's demeanor shifted the moment he saw Lorenzo's car. The warmth, the vulnerability that Alessandra had witnessed during their drive vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of the capo. He was instantly on alert, his senses heightened, his body tense. "Stay in the car," he ordered, his voice clipped and businesslike. Alessandra wanted to protest, to demand to know what was happening, but she knew better than to argue with him in this state. She watched as he exited the car and strode towards the villa, his movements purposeful and deliberate. Lorenzo was waiting for him at the entrance, his face grim, his posture rigid. Alessandra strained to hear their conversation, but the distance was too great. She could only see their gestures, the intensity of their exchange. Lorenzo was clearly agitated, his hands moving emphatically as he spoke. Dario listened intently, his expression unreadable. After a few minutes, Dario nodded curtly and turned towards the car. He opened the door and looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "There's been a problem," he said, his voice low and controlled. "A rival family, the Morettis, have made a move against us. They've attacked one of our businesses, killed several of our men." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. The Morettis were known for their brutality, their ruthlessness. This was not just a minor skirmish, it was a declaration of war. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm going to retaliate," he replied, his voice hardening. "I'm going to show them that we will not tolerate such aggression. I'm going to make them pay." Alessandra knew that this was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when the fragile peace they had built would be shattered. She wanted to plead with him, to beg him to find another way, but she knew it would be futile. He was in capo mode now, his mind set on revenge, on upholding the code, on protecting his family's honor. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes softening for a brief moment. "I will," he said, "and I'll be back." He closed the door and walked away, disappearing into the villa. Alessandra watched him go, her heart heavy with dread. She knew that this night would change everything, that the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface was about to erupt. She waited in the car, the minutes stretching into an eternity. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of sirens, a constant reminder of the chaos that was unfolding in the city. She felt helpless, trapped, a prisoner of her own fear. Finally, after what seemed like an age, Dario emerged from the villa, accompanied by several of his men. They were armed and ready for battle, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a cold determination. Dario approached the car and opened the door. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight with tension. "Isabella will take care of you. Stay inside, and don't open the door for anyone except her." Alessandra nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He leaned in and kissed her, a quick, fierce kiss that spoke of his desperation, his fear, his love. It was a kiss that said goodbye, a kiss that might be their last. "I'll come back to you, Alessandra," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I promise." Then he was gone. He got into one of the cars, and they sped away, leaving Alessandra alone in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched their taillights disappear, feeling a sense of emptiness, of despair, that she had never experienced before. She was terrified for him, terrified for what the night might bring. She knew that his life was in danger, that he might not return. She got out of the car and walked towards the villa, her legs trembling. Isabella was waiting for her at the entrance, her face pale and drawn. "Signorina," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Come inside. It's not safe out here." Alessandra followed her into the villa, the silence of the house amplifying her fear. Isabella led her to her room and locked the door. "Stay here," she said, "and don't make a sound." Isabella left, and Alessandra was alone again. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening to the sounds of the night. She could hear the distant gunfire, the screech of tires, the shouts of men. The war had begun. She prayed for Dario's safety, prayed for him to return to her. She prayed for an end to the violence, for a future that seemed impossible, a future where they could be together, free from the shadows of the Mafia world. But even as she prayed, she knew that the unspoken bonds that had formed between them, the bonds of fear, of attraction, of a shared longing for a different life, might not be strong enough to withstand the storm that was raging outside. The night was filled with uncertainty, with danger, with the echoes of a past that refused to stay buried. And Alessandra could only wait, and hope, and fear. The unspoken bonds were all she had, and they felt terribly fragile. Chapter 10. The Price of Protection. The night stretched on, an agonizing expanse of silence punctuated by bursts of distant violence. Alessandra remained locked in her room, her senses on high alert, her mind racing. She paced restlessly, unable to sit still, unable to shake the feeling of dread that consumed her. She tried to distract herself, to focus on something other than the terrifying reality of her situation, but it was impossible. Her thoughts kept returning to Dario, to the danger he was facing, to the possibility that he might not return. She found herself thinking about their conversations, about the glimpses of vulnerability he had revealed, about the hope they had shared for a different future. She clung to those memories, to those moments of connection, as a lifeline in the darkness. She went to the window and looked out, searching for any sign of his return. The estate was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the security lamps that illuminated the perimeter walls. She could see the guards patrolling the grounds, their faces grim, their weapons at the ready. She saw movement near the gates, and her heart leaped with hope. But it wasn't Dario. It was another car, approaching slowly, cautiously. She recognized the car. It belonged to one of Dario's lieutenants, a man named Marco, the same Marco who had been her father's right hand. She watched as the car stopped at the gates, and Marco spoke to the guards. After a brief exchange, the gates opened, and the car drove through, heading towards the villa. Alessandra felt a surge of relief, followed by a wave of apprehension. Marco's arrival could mean one of two things. Either Dario had sent him to check on her, or something had happened to Dario. She rushed to the door and waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard footsteps approaching, the heavy tread of a man. She held her breath, her hand on the doorknob. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A knock. "Signorina Alessandra?" It was Marco's voice. She unlocked the door and opened it cautiously. Marco stood there, his face etched with worry, his clothes stained with dirt, and something else. Something darker. "Marco," she said, her voice trembling. "What is it? What's happened?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "It's Signore Benedetti," he said, his voice low and heavy. "He's been injured." Alessandra felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if she had been stabbed. "How badly?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He's alive," Marco replied. "But he's been shot. He's lost a lot of blood. We've taken him to a private clinic, a place where we can trust the doctors." Alessandra felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of determination. "I need to see him," she said. "Take me to him." Marco hesitated again. "Signorina, it's dangerous," he said. "The Morettas are still out there. It's not safe for you to be traveling." "I don't care about the danger," Alessandra said, her voice firm. "I need to be with him." "He needs me." Marco looked at her, his eyes assessing her resolve. He saw the strength in her gaze, the determination in her stance. He knew that he couldn't refuse her. "Very well, Signorina," he said. "But we must be careful." He led her out of the villa and into the waiting car. They drove through the night, the streets of Rome eerily deserted, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of sirens. The clinic was located in a quiet, secluded neighborhood, a nondescript building that blended in with its surroundings. Marco led her through a maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing on the tiled floors. They reached a room at the end of a hallway. Marco stopped outside the door and turned to Alessandra. "He's in there," he said. "But be prepared, Signorina. He's not in good shape." Alessandra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic. Dario was lying in a bed, his body covered in bandages, his face pale and drawn. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Alessandra rushed to his side, her eyes filling with tears. She took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his skin cold and clammy. "Dario," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I'm here with you." She sat beside him, holding his hand, watching his face, praying for him to wake up. She stayed there for hours, refusing to leave his side, her presence a silent vigil, a testament to her love, her loyalty, her unwavering commitment to the man who had become her captor, her tormentor, her everything. The price of protection, she realized, was not just her freedom, but her heart. And she had paid it willingly, unknowingly, irrevocably. She was bound to him, not by chains, but by a love that had blossomed in the darkness, a love that was as fierce as it was forbidden. And she would not abandon him. Not now, not ever. The price had been paid. And now, she would face whatever came next with him, for him, because of him. Chapter 11. Cracks in the Armor. Dario remained unconscious for 3 days. Alessandra stayed by his side, sleeping in a chair next to his bed, eating only when Isabella forced her to, her entire world revolving around the man who lay fighting for his life. She spoke to him, whispered words of encouragement, of love, of hope. She read to him from his favorite books, played his favorite music, anything to try to reach him, to pull him back from the brink. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but they warned her that his injuries were severe, that he might not make a full recovery. They spoke of possible complications, of long-term damage, of the risks of infection. Alessandra refused to listen to their doubts, their negativity. She clung to the belief that he was strong, that he would survive, that their shared dream of a different future would not be shattered. She learned more about the attack, about the Morettis motives, about the ongoing war between the families. She learned that Dario had been betrayed by someone within his own organization, someone who had provided the Morettis with information about his movements, his vulnerabilities. The betrayal cut deep, adding another layer of complexity to the already volatile situation. Alessandra realized that Dario's world was even more treacherous than she had imagined, that danger lurked not only outside the family, but also within. On the 4th day, Dario finally opened his eyes. Alessandra was sitting beside him, holding his hand, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He looked at her, his gaze weak and unfocused. "Alessandra?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and raspy. She squeezed his hand, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Dario," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You're awake. You're alive." He tried to smile, but the effort was too much. He winced in pain. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She told him about the attack, about his injuries, about the betrayal. She told him about her unwavering vigil, about her love for him, about her hope for their future. He listened, his eyes closing occasionally, his strength ebbing and flowing. He was weak, vulnerable, a shadow of the powerful capo she had first met. "I almost didn't make it," he said, his voice filled with a rare admission of fear. "But you did," Alessandra replied, her voice firm. "You're strong, Dario. You're a fighter." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and affection. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't leave me." "I would never leave you, Dario," she said, her voice unwavering. "I promised you. And I keep my promises." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Thank you," he whispered. Over the next few days, Dario slowly began to recover. He regained his strength, his consciousness, his will to live. He was still in pain, still weak, but he was alive and he was fighting. Alessandra remained by his side, her presence a constant source of comfort and support. She helped him with his physical therapy, encouraged him to eat, kept him company, and shared her dreams for their future. She saw a change in him, a softening of his hard edges, a willingness to embrace the vulnerability he had always kept hidden. He spoke to her more openly, more honestly, about his fears, his regrets, his hopes. He told her about the betrayal, about the man who had sold him out. He told her that he knew who it was, that he had suspected him for some time, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. "It was Lorenzo," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "My most trusted lieutenant. The man I considered my friend." Alessandra was not surprised. She had always sensed a darkness in Lorenzo, an ambition that bordered on ruthlessness. "What will you do?" she asked. He looked at her, his eyes hardening. "I will deal with him," he said, his voice cold and determined. "But not yet. I need to regain my strength first. I need to be able to protect you." His words sent a shiver through her. She knew that he was still a dangerous man, that he was capable of violence, of ruthlessness. But she also knew that he loved her, that he would do anything to protect her. The cracks in his armor were widening, revealing the man beneath the capo, the man she had fallen in love with. But those cracks also revealed the dangers that still lurked, the threats that still surrounded them. The war was not over, and the betrayal had added a new layer of complexity, a new level of danger. The price of protection was about to rise. And they both knew it. Chapter 12. A Dance of Deception. Dario's recovery was slow and arduous, but he was determined to regain his strength, to reclaim his position, to deal with Lorenzo and the Morettas. He spent hours exercising, pushing himself to his limits, his body aching, his will unwavering. Alessandra was constantly by his side, encouraging him, supporting him, challenging him. She helped him with his physical therapy, massaged his sore muscles, and kept his spirits up. She also began to take a more active role in his business, learning about his operations, his alliances, his enemies. She discovered that Dario's organization was far more complex and far-reaching than she had ever imagined. It extended beyond Rome, beyond Italy, reaching into other countries, other continents. It involved legitimate businesses as well as illegal activities, a vast network of power and influence. She also learned more about Lorenzo, about his ambitions, his ruthlessness, his growing dissatisfaction with Dario's leadership. She discovered that Lorenzo had been secretly plotting against Dario for months, building his own power base, forging alliances with rival families, preparing to make his move. She realized that Lorenzo was not just a traitor, he was a serious threat, a danger to both Dario and herself. She knew that she had to be careful, that she couldn't trust anyone, that she had to play her own game of deception. One evening, while Dario was resting, Lorenzo came to the clinic. Alessandra was in the room, reading to Dario. Lorenzo entered cautiously, his face a mask of concern. "Signore Benedetti," he said, his voice respectful. "How are you feeling?" Dario looked at him, his eyes cold and calculating. "Better, Lorenzo," he replied, his voice tight. "Thanks to Alessandra's care." Lorenzo glanced at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. "Indeed," he said. "She has been most attentive." He tried to engage Dario in a conversation about business, about the ongoing conflict with the Morettas, about the need for decisive action. But Dario was evasive, non-committal, refusing to reveal his plans. Alessandra watched their exchange, her mind racing. She could sense the tension between them, the unspoken accusations, the hidden agendas. She knew that Lorenzo was testing Dario, probing for weaknesses, trying to assess his strength. She decided to intervene, to play her own part in the dance of deception. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice calm and measured. "I understand your concerns, but Dario needs to rest. He needs to recover before he can make any decisions." Lorenzo turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Signorina," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "With all due respect, this is not your concern. This is a matter for men." Alessandra met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. "Dario's well-being is my concern," she said. "And I will not allow anyone to jeopardize his recovery." Lorenzo glared at her, his anger barely contained. "You are overstepping, Signorina," he said. "And you are underestimating me, Lorenzo," she replied, her voice unwavering. Dario watched their exchange, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He was enjoying the spectacle, the way Alessandra was challenging Lorenzo, defending him. Lorenzo, realizing that he was getting nowhere, excused himself and left the room. Dario looked at Alessandra, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You are playing a dangerous game, Cara," he said, his voice low. "I know," she replied. "But I have to protect you, Dario. I have to protect us." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "You are braver than you know, Alessandra," he said. "And I am grateful for your loyalty." "Loyalty is a two-way street, Dario," she said. "And I expect the same from you." He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. "You have it, Alessandra," he said. "You have my loyalty, my trust, my love." The word hung in the air, unspoken for so long, finally acknowledged. It was a declaration, a commitment, a promise. But it was also a burden, a responsibility, a risk. The dance of deception was becoming more intricate, more dangerous. Alessandra was playing a double game, navigating the treacherous waters of the Mafia world, trying to protect the man she loved while also protecting herself. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between loyalty and betrayal, between love and fear, between hope and despair. And she knew that one wrong step could send them both tumbling into the abyss. The deception was necessary, but it was also a heavy weight. And she could feel it pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. She had to be strong. For both of them. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Kiss. Dario was eventually discharged from the clinic and returned to the villa, his recovery progressing steadily, his determination to confront Lorenzo and the Morettis growing stronger. He was still weak, still reliant on Alessandra's support, but his mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. He began to gather his trusted lieutenants, the men he knew he could rely on, to plan his next move. He kept his plan secret, sharing only the bare minimum of information, aware that Lorenzo's betrayal had created a climate of suspicion and mistrust. Alessandra was privy to these meetings, observing, listening, learning. She saw the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that made up the Roman underworld, the delicate balance of power that Dario had to maintain. She saw the ruthlessness, the brutality, the constant threat of violence that permeated their world. She also saw the loyalty, the camaraderie, the unspoken bonds that existed between Dario and his men. She saw the respect they had for him, the fear they had of him, the willingness to follow him into battle. One evening, Dario called a meeting in his study. He had gathered his most trusted advisors, including Marco and a few other loyal men. Alessandra was present, sitting quietly in a corner, observing the proceedings. Dario outlined his plan to deal with Lorenzo and the Morettis. He proposed a strategy of deception, of luring Lorenzo into a trap, of exposing his betrayal to the rest of the organization. He also planned a coordinated attack on the Morettis, a show of force that would demonstrate their strength and resolve. The men listened intently, nodding in agreement, their faces grim. They were ready to follow Dario's lead, to fight for their family, to avenge the attack on their capo. Alessandra, however, had reservations. She saw the risks involved, the potential for further bloodshed, the danger to Dario. Dario, she said, her voice hesitant. Are you sure this is the best course of action? Is there no other way to resolve this peacefully? The men looked at her, surprised by her intervention. They were not accustomed to a woman questioning the capo's decisions, especially in matters of war. Dario turned to her, his expression thoughtful. Peace is a luxury we cannot afford, Alessandra, he said. Not in our world. Not with our enemies. But there must be another way, she insisted. A way to avoid further violence, further loss of life. Dario considered her words, his gaze softening. He appreciated her concern, her compassion, her desire for a different outcome. Perhaps, he said, but I do not see it. Do you have a suggestion, Alessandra? She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I do, she said. But it requires trust and a willingness to take a different approach. She outlined her plan, a daring and unconventional strategy that involved using Lorenzo's own ambition against him, of exposing his treachery to the other families, of isolating him and weakening his position. It was a risky plan, a gamble, but it offered the possibility of avoiding a full-scale war. The men listened in silence, their faces skeptical. They were wary of her plan, of her influence on Dario, of her unconventional methods. Dario, however, was intrigued. He saw the intelligence behind her plan, the potential for success. He also saw the courage it took for her to speak up, to challenge him, to offer an alternative. It is a bold plan, Alessandra, he said, and a dangerous one. But it has merit. He turned to his men. We will consider Alessandra's proposal, he said. We will weigh the risks and the benefits. And we will make a decision. The meeting adjourned, leaving Alessandra feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had planted a seed, offered a different path, but she knew that the final decision rested with Dario. Later that night, as they were preparing for bed, Dario turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. You surprise me, Alessandra, he said. You constantly surprise me. I simply want to help, Dario, she replied. I want to find a way to make things better. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. You have already made things better, Kara, he said. You have shown me a different way, a different perspective. You have given me hope. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was filled with tenderness, with passion, with a deep and abiding love. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their partnership, their shared commitment to a future that was still uncertain, still dangerous, but filled with a glimmer of possibility. But as they embraced, a knock on the door interrupted them. Marco entered, his face urgent. Signore Benedetti, he said. Lorenzo is here. He demands to see you. He says it's urgent. Dario's eyes hardened. The time had come. The dance of deception was about to reach its climax. The serpent was about to be kissed. And the outcome was far from certain. Chapter 14. Revelations in the Dark. Dario's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards the bedside table, where he kept his pistol. Alessandra placed her hand on his arm, a silent plea for caution. Let me talk to him, she said, her voice low and steady. Let me see what he wants. Dario hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew she was right, that confronting Lorenzo directly could be dangerous, especially in his weakened state. But he also trusted her instincts, her intelligence, her ability to handle the situation. Be careful, Alessandra, he said, his voice tight with concern. I will, she replied, her gaze unwavering. She got out of bed and put on a silk robe, her movements deliberate and calm. She walked towards the door, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She knew this was a crucial moment, a turning point in their struggle against Lorenzo. She opened the door and found Lorenzo standing in the hallway, his face a mixture of impatience and arrogance. Signorina, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I need to speak with the capo. It's important. Dario is resting, Lorenzo, Alessandra replied, her voice calm and controlled. He's still recovering from his injuries. What is so urgent that it cannot wait until morning? Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. It's about the Morettis, he said. I have new information. Information that could change everything. Alessandra sensed a trap, a lie. She knew Lorenzo was up to something, that he was trying to manipulate them. Tell me, she said, her voice unwavering. I will relay the information to Dario. Lorenzo hesitated, his eyes darting around the hallway, as if checking for eavesdroppers. It's sensitive, he said. I need to speak with him directly. Alessandra stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. I am his confidant, Lorenzo, she said. You can trust me. Or you can leave. Lorenzo glared at her, his anger barely contained. He knew he was losing control of the situation, that Alessandra was not the naive, submissive woman he had expected. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain his composure. Very well, Signorina, he said. But this information is for Dario's ears only. Understand? I understand, Alessandra replied, her gaze unwavering. Lorenzo leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Morettis are planning another attack, he said. A bigger attack. They're going to hit us where it hurts the most. They're going to target the villa. Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. The villa was not just their home, it was a symbol of the Benedetti family's power, their legacy. An attack on the villa would be a devastating blow, a sign of weakness, an invitation for their enemies to strike. But she also knew that Lorenzo was lying. She could sense it in his eyes, in his voice, in his body language. He was trying to scare them, to manipulate them, to force Dario into a rash decision. When? She asked, her voice calm, betraying none of her inner turmoil. When are they planning to attack? Lorenzo hesitated again, his eyes flickering.
Soon, he said.
Very soon. We need to act quickly. We need to strike first. Alessandra knew that this was his true objective. He wanted to provoke Dario into a war that would weaken the Benedetti family, a war that would create an opportunity for him to seize power. Thank you for the information, Lorenzo, she said, her voice steady. I will inform Dario. You may go. Lorenzo looked at her, surprised by her calm demeanor. He had expected her to panic, to react emotionally, to fall for his trap. "But shouldn't we do something?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. "Shouldn't we prepare for the attack?" "Dario will decide what to do," Alessandra replied, her voice unwavering. "He is the capo, Lorenzo."
"Not you."
Lorenzo glared at her, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew he had failed, that Alessandra had seen through his deception. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the hallway. Alessandra watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had won this round, but the battle was far from over. She closed the door and returned to the bedroom. Dario was sitting up in bed, his eyes filled with questions.
"What did he want?"
he asked, his voice tense. Alessandra told him everything, recounting Lorenzo's words, her suspicions, her assessment of his motives. Dario listened intently, his expression hardening. He knew that Alessandra was right, that Lorenzo was a traitor, that he was plotting against them. "He's lying," Dario said, his voice cold and determined. "He's trying to manipulate us. He wants us to attack the Morettus, to weaken ourselves, to create an opportunity for him to make his move." "What will you do?" Alessandra asked. Dario smiled, a chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I will play his game, Alessandra," he said. "I will use his own deception against him. I will expose him for the traitor he is. And I will make him pay." The revelations in the dark had confirmed their suspicions, solidified their resolve, and set in motion a plan that would determine the fate of the Benedetti family, the future of their relationship, and the outcome of the war that was brewing. The night was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The truth had been revealed, and the consequences were about to unfold. Chapter 15. Flight and Pursuit. Dario's plan was intricate and daring, a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to expose Lorenzo's treachery and neutralize the threat he posed. It involved a complex web of deception, misinformation, and strategic alliances, a game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of the Roman underworld. Alessandra was an integral part of the plan, her intelligence, her intuition, her understanding of human nature proving invaluable. She acted as Dario's confidant, his advisor, his partner in deception. She helped him craft the false narrative they would feed to Lorenzo, the carefully planted clues that would lead him into their trap. They spent days preparing, meticulously planning every detail, anticipating every possible outcome. They worked in secret, communicating through coded messages, meeting in secluded locations, aware that Lorenzo's spies were everywhere. The plan hinged on convincing Lorenzo that Dario was planning a major offensive against the Morettus, a preemptive strike that would cripple their rivals and secure the Benedetti family's dominance. They leaked false information to Lorenzo's informants, fabricated documents, and staged conversations, all designed to create the illusion of an impending attack. They also reached out to other families, forging secret alliances, securing their support in the event of a conflict. They played on old rivalries, exploited existing tensions, and offered incentives, all to isolate Lorenzo and weaken his position. The tension was palpable, the air thick with suspicion and mistrust. Everyone was on edge, aware that one wrong move could expose their plan and lead to disaster. Alessandra felt the pressure constantly, the weight of their deception, the fear of discovery. One evening, as they were reviewing the final details of their plan, Dario turned to Alessandra, his eyes filled with concern. "This is dangerous, Cara," he said, his voice low and serious. "Too dangerous. I don't want you involved anymore. I want you to leave Rome. I want you to go somewhere safe, where Lorenzo can't reach you." Alessandra was taken aback. She had expected him to want her by his side, to rely on her support, her partnership. "No, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "I will not leave you.
"I will not abandon you."
"We are in this together." He tried to reason with her, to convince her that it was too risky, that he couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to her. But she was adamant, refusing to back down. "I am not afraid, Dario," she said. "And I am not helpless. I can protect myself. And I can help you. I will not be a burden." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and frustration. He knew he couldn't change her mind, that her determination was as strong as his own. "Very well, Alessandra," he said, his voice resigned. "But you will follow my instructions. You will be careful, and you will do exactly as I say." "I will," she replied, her gaze unwavering. The plan was set in motion. They fed Lorenzo the final piece of false information, the date and time of the supposed attack on the Morettus. They watched as Lorenzo took the bait, as he mobilized his forces, as he prepared to betray Dario and seize power. But then, something unexpected happened. Lorenzo's men stormed the villa, not to attack the Morettus, but to capture Dario and Alessandra. They had been betrayed, their plan exposed. Someone had tipped Lorenzo off. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouts, the sounds of fighting filled the villa. Dario and Alessandra were caught off guard, trapped in their own home. "We need to get out of here," Dario said, his voice urgent.
Now.
They fled through the villa, dodging bullets, evading Lorenzo's men. They reached a secret passage, a hidden escape route that Dario had built years ago. "This will lead us to the garage," he said. "We can take a car and escape." They ran through the dark, narrow passage, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear Lorenzo's men pursuing them, their shouts echoing through the tunnels. They reached the garage and found a car, a fast, unmarked vehicle that Dario kept for emergencies. They jumped inside, Dario taking the wheel. He sped out of the garage, crashing through the gates, Lorenzo's men firing at them. The chase was on. They raced through the streets of Rome, Dario driving with a skill and precision that Alessandra had never seen before. He weaved through traffic, took sharp turns, and pushed the car to its limits. Lorenzo's men were close behind, their bullets hitting the car, shattering the windows. Alessandra ducked down, her heart racing, her fear overwhelming. "Hold on," Dario shouted, his voice tight with concentration. He swerved the car down a narrow alley, barely avoiding a collision. He took another turn and another, trying to shake off their pursuers. They were losing them, gaining distance, but the chase was far from over. They were in a desperate race for survival, a flight from the treachery that had engulfed them. The carefully laid plan had crumbled, and now they were running for their lives. The pursuit was relentless, the danger immediate, and the future uncertain. All they had was each other, and the hope that they could somehow escape. Chapter 16. The Heart's Reckoning. The chase continued through the night, a relentless pursuit across the darkened landscape. Dario drove with a fierce determination, his focus unwavering, his skill unmatched. Alessandra sat beside him, her body tense, her senses on high alert, her fear battling with a growing sense of exhilaration. They left the city behind, speeding along winding country roads, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the engine roaring in defiance. They were heading towards a coast, towards a safe house that Dario had prepared years ago, a secluded refuge where they could regroup and plan their next move. But Lorenzo's men were still pursuing them, their cars closing in, their bullets still finding their mark. Dario managed to evade them, to outmaneuver them, but the pressure was constant, the threat ever present. At one point, a bullet shattered the rear window, showering them with glass. Alessandra screamed, ducking down, her hands covering her head. "Are you all right?" Dario shouted, his voice filled with concern. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. "Just drive." He pushed the car harder, faster, his determination fueled by a mixture of anger and fear. He had to protect her, had to get her to safety, had to keep her alive. They reached the coast, the sea stretching out before them, vast and dark and ominous. The safe house was located on a remote cliff, overlooking the water, hidden from view. Dario drove the car along a narrow, treacherous road, the tires barely gripping the edge of the cliff. The wind howled, the waves crashed against the rocks below, the danger palpable. They finally reached the safe house, a small, unassuming cottage that blended in with its surroundings. Dario parked the car in a hidden garage, and they quickly made their way inside. The cottage was sparsely furnished, but it had everything they needed: food, water, medical supplies, and a secure communication system. Dario locked the doors, checked the windows, and activated the security system. They were safe for now. But they were also trapped, isolated, cut off from the outside world. Alessandra collapsed onto a sofa, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Dario sat beside her, his arm around her, his touch a source of comfort and reassurance. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're safe." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You saved us, Dario," she said. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "We saved each other, Alessandra," he said. "We did it together." They sat in silence for a long moment, their bodies touching, their hearts beating in unison. The fear began to subside, replaced by a profound sense of connection, of intimacy, of love. Dario turned to her, his eyes searching hers. I need to tell you something, Alessandra," he said, his voice hesitant. "What is it?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "I love you, Alessandra," he said. "I love you more than anything in the world. I love you more than my own life." The words hung in the air, a declaration that had been building for so long, a truth that could no longer be denied. Alessandra's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had blossomed in the darkness, a love that had defied all odds. "I love you too, Dario," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you with all my heart." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was filled with passion, with tenderness, with a desperate longing that had been held back for too long. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their shared future. They spent the night together, holding each other close, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating as one. They made love, a passionate and tender act that transcended the fear and the danger that surrounded them. It was an affirmation of life, of love, of hope. But as the dawn approached, reality began to creep back in. They were still fugitives, still hunted, still in danger. They had to make a plan, had to find a way to fight back, to reclaim their lives. Dario contacted Marco, using the secure communication system. He learned that the villa had been severely damaged, that several of their men had been killed or injured, that Lorenzo had seized control of the organization. He also learned that the betrayal had come from within, from a source they had never suspected, Isabella, the seemingly loyal and efficient housekeeper. She had been working for Lorenzo all along, feeding him information, sabotaging their plans. The revelation hit Dario hard. He had trusted Isabella, had considered her a part of the family. The betrayal cut deep, adding another layer of complexity to their already desperate situation. Alessandra saw the pain in his eyes, the anger, the sense of betrayal. She knew that he was hurting, that he was struggling to come to terms with the treachery that had surrounded him. "We will get through this, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "Together, we will find a way to defeat Lorenzo, to expose Isabella, to reclaim what is ours." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and determination. "You are my strength, Alessandra," he said. "My reason to fight. My reason to live." The heart's reckoning had come, and they had faced it together, their love stronger, their bond unbreakable. But the fight was far from over. They were fugitives, hunted and betrayed, but they were not defeated. They had each other, and they had a plan. And they would not rest until they had reclaimed their lives, their future, their love. The reckoning had strengthened them. And now, they were ready for the final battle. Chapter 17. Blood and Betrayal. The following days were a blur of frantic planning and clandestine communication. Dario and Alessandra, isolated in their coastal hideaway, worked tirelessly to devise a strategy to counter Lorenzo's power grab and expose Isabella's treachery. They reached out to their remaining loyal allies, piecing together a fragile network of support, navigating a treacherous landscape of shifting allegiances and hidden agendas. Marco, still loyal and fighting from within, provided them with crucial intelligence, updating them on Lorenzo's movements, his plans, his growing paranoia. He also confirmed their suspicions about Isabella, revealing that she had been recruited by Lorenzo years ago, planted in the Benedetti household as a sleeper agent, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The revelation of Isabella's betrayal was a particularly bitter pill for Dario to swallow. He had trusted her implicitly, considered her a member of the extended family, relied on her discretion and efficiency. The knowledge that she had been working against him all along, feeding information to his enemies, fueled his anger and strengthened his resolve to reclaim what he had lost. Alessandra, while shocked by Isabella's duplicity, was less surprised than Dario. She had always sensed a coldness beneath Isabella's efficient exterior, a hidden agenda that she couldn't quite decipher. Now, everything made sense. The whispers, the evasions, the guarded looks, it all pointed to Isabella's treachery. They decided to focus on exposing Isabella first. They knew that Lorenzo's power base was built on lies and deception, and that revealing his connection to Isabella would undermine his credibility and weaken his hold on the organization. They crafted a plan to leak information about Isabella's betrayal to key members of the family, using Marco as their conduit. They knew it was a risky move, that it could backfire, but they had no other choice. They had to strike quickly and decisively. The plan worked to a degree. The news of Isabella's treachery spread like wildfire through the ranks of the Benedetti organization, creating confusion, doubt, and dissent. Lorenzo's authority was challenged, his decisions questioned, his leadership undermined. But Lorenzo was not one to go down without a fight. He retaliated swiftly and brutally, silencing his critics, eliminating his rivals, and consolidating his power through fear and intimidation. He also launched a manhunt for Dario and Alessandra, determined to eliminate them once and for all. The situation became increasingly precarious. Dario and Alessandra were forced to move from one safe house to another, constantly on the run, never knowing when or where Lorenzo's men might strike. They lived on edge, their senses heightened, their trust in short supply. One evening, as they were hiding in a small, abandoned farmhouse, they received a message from Marco. He had discovered that Lorenzo was planning a meeting with the heads of several other families, a gathering that would solidify his position as the new capo of the Benedetti organization. "This is our chance, Dario," Alessandra said, her voice urgent. "We need to expose Lorenzo at this meeting. We need to show everyone the truth." Dario knew she was right. It was a risky move, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance to reclaim their lives, to defeat Lorenzo and restore the balance of power. "We'll need a plan," he said, his voice determined. "A plan that will get us into the meeting undetected, a plan that will allow us to expose Lorenzo without getting killed." They spent hours devising a strategy, meticulously planning every detail, anticipating every possible contingency. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, that they were walking into a trap, but they had no other choice. The meeting was to be held at a secluded villa outside Rome, a heavily guarded fortress that would be difficult to penetrate. They decided to use Marco's inside knowledge to gain access, posing as members of his security detail. The night of the meeting arrived, a dark and ominous night that mirrored the tension and danger that filled their hearts. They dressed in black, their faces hidden, their weapons concealed. They drove to the villa, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing. Marco met them at the gates, his face grim. "Be careful," he whispered. "Lorenzo is expecting trouble. He's doubled the security." They entered the villa, their movements cautious and deliberate. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with suspicion. The heads of the other families were already gathered in the main hall, their faces grim, their eyes watchful. Lorenzo was at the head of the table, his posture arrogant, his demeanor confident. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing. "Marco," he said, his voice laced with suspicion.
"Who are these men?"
Before Marco could answer, Dario stepped forward, removing his disguise. "It's me, Lorenzo," he said, his voice cold and steady. "The man you betrayed. The man you tried to kill." A gasp went through the room. The other family heads looked at Dario in shock, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. Lorenzo's face turned pale. He had not expected Dario to appear, to confront him so boldly. "You're supposed to be dead," he stammered. "Not yet, Lorenzo," Dario replied. Not while I have breath in my body to expose you for the traitor you are. He turned to the other family heads. This man, he said, pointing at Lorenzo, is a liar and a deceiver. He betrayed me, he betrayed the Benedetti family, and he will betray you. He is working with Isabella, a spy who has been feeding information to our enemies for years. Lorenzo tried to deny the accusations, to shout Dario down, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of disbelief and anger that filled the room. Alessandra stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Lorenzo.
We have proof, she said.
Proof of your treachery, proof of your connection to Isabella. She produced a series of documents, intercepted messages, and recorded conversations, all of which implicated Lorenzo and Isabella in the plot against Dario. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The other family heads looked at Lorenzo with disgust, their faces filled with contempt. Lorenzo, realizing that he had been exposed, that his game was over, made a desperate move. He pulled out a gun and aimed it at Dario. But before he could fire, Marco intervened, tackling Lorenzo to the ground. A struggle ensued, the gun going off, the bullet hitting Isabella who, to everyone's shock, had entered the room silently during the commotion. She crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide with surprise, her body bleeding. Lorenzo screamed in anguish. He crawled to Isabella, and he tried to stop the bleeding. Marco secured the gun, and other men restrained Lorenzo. It was over. Blood and betrayal had marked the night. And the consequences were only just beginning. Chapter 18. A love forged in fire. The aftermath of the confrontation was chaotic. Lorenzo, consumed by grief and rage over Isabella's death, was taken into custody by the other family heads, his fate uncertain. Isabella's body was removed, a stark reminder of the betrayal and violence that had permeated their world. Dario, though shaken by the events, regained control of the situation, asserting his authority and re-establishing order. The other family heads, initially shocked and disbelieving, were now convinced of Lorenzo's treachery and Isabella's duplicity. They pledged their support to Dario, reaffirming their loyalty to the Benedetti family and vowing to assist in restoring stability and peace. Marco, hailed as a hero for his intervention, was reinstated to his position as Dario's trusted consigliere, his loyalty unquestioned, his reputation enhanced. He had played a crucial role in exposing Lorenzo and Isabella, and his actions had saved Dario's life. Alessandra, though traumatized by the violence she had witnessed, stood by Dario's side, her strength and resolve unwavering. She had played a pivotal role in their survival, her intelligence, her intuition, and her courage proving invaluable. She had faced danger head-on, risked her life for the man she loved, and emerged victorious. In the days that followed, Dario took steps to consolidate his power, to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on his family, and to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. He reached out to those who had been wronged by Lorenzo, offering apologies, making amends, and promising a new era of cooperation and respect. He also dealt with the lingering threat of the Morettas, negotiating a truce, a fragile peace that would prevent further bloodshed and allow both families to rebuild. He knew that the peace was precarious, that it could be broken at any moment, but he was determined to find a way to end the cycle of violence, to create a more stable and secure future. He and Alessandra returned to the villa, their home now scarred by the violence that had taken place there. They began the long and arduous process of repairing the damage, both physical and emotional. They cleaned, they rebuilt, they replanted, transforming the villa from a fortress into a sanctuary, a place of healing and hope. One evening, as they were sitting together in the garden, the air filled with the scent of roses and the sound of the sea, Dario turned to Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. "I owe you everything, Alessandra," he said, his voice soft and tender. "You saved my life, you saved my family, you saved my soul." She smiled, her heart filled with a profound sense of contentment. "We saved each other, Dario," she said. "We did it together." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "I made you a promise," he said. a promise to protect you, to give you a life free from fear, a life of happiness and love. And you kept that promise, Dario, she replied, even when it seemed impossible. He pulled her close, his arms embracing her, his body sheltering her. I want to make you another promise, he said, his voice a whisper in her ear. A promise to marry you, Alessandra. To make you my wife, my partner, my queen. Tears welled up in Alessandra's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. She had come to this world as a captive, a pawn, a possession. But she had found something she never expected, a love that transcended the darkness, a love that had transformed her, a love that had given her a purpose, a future, a home. Yes, Dario, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed her then, a kiss that was filled with passion, with tenderness, with a profound sense of commitment. It was a kiss that sealed their destiny, their future, their love. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the garden of the villa, surrounded by the beauty they had restored, the peace they had fought for. Only their closest friends and allies were invited, those who had stood by them through the darkness, those who believed in their vision of a new future. Alessandra wore a simple, elegant gown, her silver-streaked hair adorned with flowers, her eyes sparkling with happiness. Dario, dressed in a dark suit, looked younger, healthier, his face free from the lines of tension and worry that had marked him for so long. They exchanged vows, promises of love, of loyalty, of a shared life filled with hope and purpose. They were no longer capo and captive, but husband and wife, partners in a new beginning, a love forged in fire, a future yet to be written. The fire had tested them, and it had made their love indestructible. Chapter 19. The Lioness Awakens. The months following their marriage were a time of rebuilding, of healing, of transformation. Dario, guided by Alessandra's influence, began to implement changes within the Benedetti organization, shifting away from the traditional reliance on violence and intimidation towards a more diplomatic and business-oriented approach. He invested in legitimate enterprises, diversified their holdings, and fostered relationships with other families based on mutual respect and cooperation. Alessandra, no longer a passive observer, took on an increasingly active role in the family's affairs. She used her intelligence, her education, and her innate understanding of human nature to advise Dario, to negotiate deals, and to build bridges with the outside world. She became known as La Leonessa, the lioness, a woman of strength, grace, and unwavering determination, a force to be reckoned with. She also focused on improving the lives of the women within the organization, empowering them with education, opportunities, and a voice in the family's decisions. She challenged the traditional patriarchal structures, advocating for equality, respect, and a recognition of the valuable contributions that women could make. Not everyone welcomed these changes. There were those within the organization who clung to the old ways, who resented Alessandra's influence, who saw Dario's new approach as a sign of weakness. They grumbled in the shadows, plotted in secret, and waited for an opportunity to challenge the new order. Dario was aware of the dissent, but he was determined to stay the course. He knew that change was necessary, that the old ways were unsustainable, that the future of the Benedetti family depended on adapting to a changing world. He trusted Alessandra's judgment, her instincts, her unwavering commitment to a better future. One day, a crisis erupted. A rival family, the Salernos, long-standing enemies of the Benedettis, made a move to encroach on their territory, threatening their businesses and challenging their authority. It was a deliberate provocation, a test of Dario's resolve, a challenge to his new leadership. The old guard within the Benedetti organization clamored for a violent response, a show of force that would crush the Salernos and reassert their dominance. They urged Dario to unleash his men, to wage war, to remind everyone who the Benedettis were. Dario, however, hesitated. He had promised Alessandra and himself that he would seek peaceful solutions, that he would avoid bloodshed whenever possible. He knew that a war with the Salernos would be costly, destructive, and ultimately counterproductive. Alessandra, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. "Dario," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "Let me handle this. Let me talk to the Salernos. Let me find a way to resolve this peacefully." Dario was reluctant. He knew the Salernos were ruthless and unpredictable, that they would not be easily swayed. He feared for Alessandra's safety, for the danger she would face. "It's too risky, Alessandra," he said. "I cannot allow you to put yourself in harm's way." "I am not afraid, Dario," she replied, her voice unwavering. "And I am not without resources. I have built relationships, I have earned respect, and I believe I can find a solution." She convinced him, her confidence and determination swaying his doubts. He agreed to let her try, to give her a chance to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Alessandra contacted the head of the Salerno family, Don Antonio Salerno, an old and formidable man known for his cunning and his ruthlessness. She requested a meeting, a neutral ground where they could discuss their differences and find a way to avoid conflict. Don Antonio, intrigued by Alessandra's reputation and her audacity, agreed to meet. He saw an opportunity to test her, to assess her strength, to perhaps even gain an advantage over the Benedettis. The meeting took place at a secluded villa, a neutral territory chosen for its security and its privacy. Alessandra arrived with a small entourage of her own trusted advisors, her demeanor calm and confident, her eyes betraying none of the apprehension she felt. Don Antonio greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He was an old-school mafia boss, accustomed to dealing with men, to using violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. He underestimated Alessandra, seeing her as a woman, a wife, a mere pawn in Dario's game. But Alessandra quickly disabused him of that notion. She spoke with authority, with intelligence, with a deep understanding of the intricacies of their world. She presented her case clearly and concisely, outlining the benefits of cooperation, the dangers of conflict, the potential for a mutually beneficial resolution. She also appealed to Don Antonio's sense of reason, his desire to protect his own family, his own legacy. She reminded him of the costs of war, the lives that would be lost, the businesses that would be destroyed, the instability that would ensue. Don Antonio listened intently, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to respect. He saw in Alessandra a formidable opponent, a woman of strength and intelligence, a leader in her own right. The negotiations were long and arduous, filled with tense moments, heated arguments, and veiled threats. But Alessandra held her ground, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to back down. Finally, after hours of negotiation, they reached an agreement. A compromise that would protect both families' interests, avoid bloodshed, and establish a fragile peace. Alessandra had done it. She had achieved the impossible. She had stared down a ruthless mafia boss and emerged victorious. She had proven that diplomacy, intelligence, and courage could be more powerful than violence and intimidation. She returned to Dario, triumphant, her reputation enhanced, her position solidified. She had shown everyone, both within and outside the Benedetti family, that she was a force to be reckoned with, a leader in her own right, a true lioness. The awakening was complete, and the roar was deafening. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Despite Alessandra's diplomatic triumph with the Salernos, the undercurrents of discontent within the Benedetti ranks remained. The old guard, those who yearned for the glory days of unrestrained power and violence, saw Dario's reforms and Alessandra's influence as a betrayal of their traditions. Their whispers of dissent grew louder, their plotting more brazen. At the heart of this brewing rebellion was Aldo Mancini, a cousin of Dario's, a man who had long coveted the position of capo. He was a charismatic and ruthless individual, steeped in the old ways, and he skillfully exploited the dissatisfaction of the traditionalists to build a power base of his own. He secretly amassed support, promising a return to the true Benedetti values, a restoration of their dominance through force. Dario and Alessandra were aware of Aldo's machinations, but they hoped to contain the situation through diplomacy and strategic alliances. They focused on strengthening the bonds with families who supported their vision of a more peaceful and prosperous future, isolating Aldo and his followers. However, Aldo was not to be underestimated. He had been patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike, and he believed that moment had arrived. He orchestrated a series of events designed to destabilize Dario's leadership and create an opening for his own power grab. First, there were rumors spread about Dario's health, suggesting that he was no longer fit to lead, that his injuries had left him weakened and indecisive. Then, there were acts of sabotage against Benedetti businesses, designed to undermine their financial stability and create an atmosphere of chaos. Finally, there was a direct challenge to Dario's authority, a refusal by several key members of the organization to follow his orders. Dario and Alessandra knew that they were facing a critical juncture. Aldo's rebellion had to be crushed swiftly and decisively, or it would risk plunging the family into a bloody civil war. But they also knew that a violent confrontation would undermine everything they had been working to achieve, the fragile peace they had built, the new direction they had charted for the Benedetti family. They decided on a two-pronged approach. First, they would use their network of informants and allies to gather irrefutable evidence of Aldo's treachery, exposing his plans to the rest of the family. Second, they would prepare for a possible confrontation, ensuring that they had the loyal forces necessary to defend themselves and maintain order. Alessandra played a crucial role in gathering intelligence, using her connections and her sharp intuition to uncover Aldo's secrets. She discovered that he had been secretly colluding with rival families, promising them a share of the Benedetti spoils in exchange for their support. She also found evidence of his involvement in the sabotage of their businesses and the spread of false rumors about Dario's health. Armed with this damning evidence, Dario called a meeting of the entire Benedetti organization, a gathering that would determine the future of the family. He knew that this was a gamble, that it could either solidify his leadership or plunge them into open warfare. But he had faith in Alessandra, in their shared vision, and in the loyalty of those who believed in a better future. The meeting took place in the grand hall of the villa, the same place where Lorenzo's treachery had been exposed. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and apprehension. The members of the family were divided, their loyalties uncertain, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. Dario, standing tall and resolute, addressed the assembled crowd. He spoke of his vision for the family, of his commitment to peace and prosperity, of his determination to build a better future for all of them. He then presented the evidence of Aldo's treachery, laying bare his plans, his betrayals, his ambition to seize power through violence and deceit. Aldo, caught off guard by the overwhelming evidence against him, tried to deny the accusations, to rally his supporters, to challenge Dario's authority. But his words rang hollow, his lies exposed, his credibility shattered. The majority of the family members, swayed by the evidence and by Dario's impassioned plea, turned against Aldo, denouncing his treachery and reaffirming their loyalty to Dario. But Aldo, cornered and desperate, refused to surrender. He drew a weapon, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and defiance. His loyalists, a small but determined group, followed suit, creating a tense standoff. "You may have swayed the sheep, Dario," Aldo snarled, "but you will not defeat me. I will take what is rightfully mine, even if it means spilling blood." Before anyone could react, Alessandra stepped forward, placing herself between Dario and Aldo, her body shielding her husband. "Enough, Aldo," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This ends now. There will be no more bloodshed. There will be no more division. We are a family, and we will resolve this peacefully." Aldo looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. He had underestimated her strength, her courage, her unwavering commitment to peace. "You are a fool, Alessandra," he said. "You cannot stop me." "Perhaps not," she replied. "But I can try. And I will not stand by and watch you destroy everything we have built." She turned to the assembled family members, her voice ringing out with authority and conviction. "We have a choice to make," she said. "We can choose violence, division, and destruction. Or we can choose peace, unity, and a future where we all prosper. The choice is yours." Her words resonated with the crowd. The tension began to dissipate, the desire for violence fading, replaced by a growing sense of hope, of a shared commitment to a better future. Aldo's supporters, seeing that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began to waver, their resolve crumbling. One by one, they lowered their weapons, surrendering to Dario's authority. Aldo, isolated and defeated, was finally disarmed and taken into custody. His rebellion had been crushed, his ambition thwarted, his treachery exposed. The final confrontation had been one of hearts and loyalties, a battle between the old ways and the new, between violence and peace, between division and unity. And in the end, love, courage, and a shared vision had triumphed. The Benedetti family, scarred but not broken, had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with hope, with possibility, with the promise of a new beginning. The confrontation had tested them all, and they had passed the test. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the transformative power of love and leadership. Dario and Alessandra, hand in hand, guided the Benedetti family into a new era, one marked by peace, prosperity, and a gradual shift away from the violent traditions of the past. The villa, once a symbol of power and intimidation, became a haven of warmth and hospitality, its doors open to friends, allies, and even former rivals. The gardens, meticulously tended by Alessandra, flourished, a vibrant testament to the beauty that could be cultivated even in the most challenging of environments. Dario, guided by Alessandra's wisdom and compassion, continued to implement reforms within the organization, diversifying their businesses, investing in legitimate enterprises, and fostering relationships based on trust and mutual respect. He became known not only as a powerful capo, but also as a shrewd businessman, a diplomat, and a philanthropist. Alessandra, La Leonessa, became a legend in her own right. Her influence extended far beyond the confines of the Benedetti family, her counsel sought by leaders in both the underworld and the legitimate world. She championed the rights of women, promoted education, and fostered a culture of peace and understanding. She became a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the transformative power of a woman's strength and determination. Aldo Mancini, stripped of his power and exiled from the family, eventually faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked and loyalty betrayed. His fate served as a reminder of the consequences of choosing violence and division over unity and cooperation. Marco, ever loyal, remained Dario's trusted consigliere, his right-hand man, his friend. He witnessed the transformation of the Benedetti family with pride, knowing that he had played a crucial role in their survival and their success. The Morettis and other rival families gradually came to accept the new order, recognizing the benefits of peace and cooperation over constant conflict. The Roman underworld, once a battleground of violence and treachery, slowly evolved into a more complex and nuanced landscape where diplomacy and negotiation often replaced bloodshed. Dario and Alessandra, though they never forgot the dangers of their world, found solace and joy in their love for each other, in their shared commitment to a better future. They had faced countless challenges, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and emerged stronger and more united than ever before. They often walked together in the garden, hand in hand, reminiscing about their journey, the trials they had endured, the triumphs they had celebrated. They remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the moments of despair, but also the love, the loyalty, the unwavering hope that had sustained them. One evening, as the sun set over the Roman skyline, casting a golden glow over the villa and the gardens, Dario turned to Alessandra, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "We did it, Cara," he said, his voice soft and tender. "We built a new world, a better world." Alessandra smiled, her heart overflowing with contentment. "We did it together, Dario," she replied. "And we will continue to build it, together, for as long as we have breath in our bodies." They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. They were no longer capo and captive, but husband and wife, partners in a life filled with love, purpose, and a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The gilded cage had crumbled, the wolf had been tamed, and the lioness had roared. And in their shared journey, they had found a love that was stronger than fear, a love that had conquered all. The sun set, casting a golden glow over the future they have created. It was beautiful and strong. And theirs. The end.